I recall reading the other week, I believe it was on Reddit, about a young child at school who had issues with his parents. His parents had, of course, broken up over something that was not explained fully in the post, but the child's reaction at school, I think, illustrates a point that needs to be acknowledged, because these are actual human beings. This child, who was about 7, had tried to kill himself because he figured that by killing himself, his parents would get back together. And I think we all know from our own experience that although maybe it isn't quite so pronounced in our own lives, this is a spirit in the culture at the moment. So it's very, very important to analyse why this is happening to our children, and how us watching those future mother and fathers who are viewing this on the internet, we need to understand how important it is we change the way things are at the moment, because I don't know about you, but I don't want any child of mine ending up in that kind of mindset. That would crush me, and it would crush you, and it crushes the society at large, because we cannot run a society on people who are depressed and deeply hurt like this, particularly at such a young age. We live in a world that's atypical, very unstable, and has many social problems that will ultimately potentially destroy the countries that we live in. However, in all of these issues, we can find many lessons that can make our lives better. Throughout most of history, we've acknowledged, at least on some level, that the fundamental building block of a society is the family. And this is one of those very few times where we haven't. It was the means by which our cultures and religions spread, it was the means by which economic institutions were built, and it was the means that we built all other things in this civilization through the communications of families. But now this is broken down in a number of ways. So, why exactly did this happen, and what can we learn from it? Well, in order to do that, we have to look at the causes and then come to conclusions based on those causes. First of all, we should clarify what we mean by family. I do not mean the nuclear family. The nuclear family of one mother, one father, and a number of children is not a family. It's an easily subvertible unit that has led to the current social milieu today, because on its own it's too weak. A family is grandparents, great-grandparents, children, aunts and uncles. The whole unit. Sometimes they call them clans, but I'm calling them families because that's what they are. All genetically related people, often in the same house or the same neighbourhood, coordinating for their own best efforts and keeping a level of self-control within that particular unit based on a bond of love, common culture, and relation, be that genetic or not. One of the biggest things to undermine this was the mass push for women to work in the workplace. Now, let me make this very, very clear. Women have always worked, even since year dot. You can tell this from the Book of Ruth, for example, where Ruth works for Boaz and eventually ends up marrying him, working within a field, as other women did. This is clearly something that has always existed, but it's never existed on the same level that it has today. Now, this has been pushed since, at the very latest, the 1960s, with the second wave feminist movement that pushed to get women into the workplace, in fact against women's best interests, pushing women into 40-hour work weeks as men did, to be accountants or lawyers or things like this. And of course, being women and being in that revolutionary milieu that was going on during the 1960s, people jumped at the opportunity and made many, many mistakes. I'm sure we all have women in our families that have sacrificed large parts of their lives at careers that have ultimately been unfulfilling. Now, the initial ideological impulse to do this lies in the revolutionary ideologies of the 19th century, as well as the influence from the 18th century. This idea that Christian culture was somehow repressive. This is the thing that led the intellectuals that made this movement initially. But what really gave it power is when the bourgeoisie, or those people who run businesses, realised that they could get women into particularly in office jobs, and they would fulfill the same function as the men in those jobs to greater or lesser degree. And so by doing this, they could reduce the amount of money they had to pay for white-collar employees. There's a reason why it's still lucrative to be a tradesman as a young man, because you don't have the same level of competition from women. Likewise, with a lot of the more technical white-collar jobs like software engineering, although they're pushing women to get into that, most women just don't find it especially appealing, and so the wages stay high because there are less people they are willing to hire. Whereas women are often very good at jobs like HR and stuff like that, and so because there's a greater variety of employees that can be hired, the wages have, of course, dropped, or at least are lower in comparison to the jobs that I just mentioned. Now, I can think of 3 results that we can all pretty much see immediately. So first of all, you have women in the workplace in oppressive 40-hour work weeks, which nobody likes. There's very, very few people that like them, especially women, because women tend to prefer to look after people than to sit in a cubicle all day and type away at a computer screen. So women have become more unhappy. Also, by virtue of the destabilising of the wages, you now need 2 incomes to support a middle-class house, for most people. So women and men have less time to be intimate with each other because they don't have the energy and they don't have the time. And finally, the biggest problem is that now children are being raised by daycares and being raised by public schools that don't know how to deal with them properly. Now, I was blessed in my upbringing because my mother stayed at home and looked after me to an extent as a small child, so I wasn't subjected to daycare like many of you watching were in the same way. But it's safe to say that this particular part of life has become omnipresent, and it's effectively raising a majority of our generation, and probably even more for generations to come. And I don't think enough people are talking about how detrimental this actually is. Now, this is of course not to say that the people taking care of these children are in any way horrible. I think that the majority of the people involved in daycare and in early education are people who genuinely love these children and want to take care of them, which is a great human instinct that needs to be encouraged. However, it has reduced the amount of attention that the children get from their own parents, and so this weakens the act. And as much as perhaps a year R teacher or somebody running a kindergarten in the United States may love children, they cannot replicate that bond in the same way as a mother and father can with their own child. So of course this leads to a weakening of the father and daughter bond and the mother and son bond, because they see less of their own children and much of their education is taken care of by somebody either employed by the state or by somebody employed by a private institution whose job it is to make sure that there are standardised results out of these children, and secondarily to make sure that they're all okay. Now, over time, this means that children raised in this situation will place less of an importance on family because they simply can't comprehend how strong the bonds can actually be and how strong they should be. And this, of course, as generations go by, will weaken and weaken and weaken the family even more. And the last thing we need to do is to split more families, because the family is the fundamental foundation of any nation or of any state. Without the family, there can be no wider society, because the wider society is just a larger family, and you need fundamental blocks in order to build these larger institutions. This particular predicament that children are in, as much as the people involved may care for the children under their care, will still weaken the bond to the point where it's already a very serious issue with relationships among people just coming of age. And it'll only get worse as time goes on. Now, one thing that makes this weakening of the bond so incredibly dangerous, and probably the death knell of Western society, is that we've introduced no-fault divorce, so that if people aren't willing to build the bond necessary to overpower some sort of problem, or they've developed some sort of neuroses that they want to that they need to work through. Right? They don't have to do that because they can just go and get a divorce. A no-fault divorce. Now, I think that no-fault divorce has been talked about until the cows come home in regards to male problems with it, because it's very obvious that this could be used to divorce rape a man if he's not careful. This has happened so many times that a man could get really, really seriously damaged by a no-fault divorce because it could lead to alimony problems, especially if the man is not in a good position to make loads of money, which frankly the majority of men aren't. But the problem is far, far bigger than that, and arguably worse for women involved. Now, there are a number of reasons why relationships break up. The largest two that I've heard of are cheating and money issues, and they're pretty common, and in previous times they'd have been worked through, or they wouldn't have occurred at all if you'd chosen a decent woman. But there are also these other ones that are really silly, right? Like things that just seem really stupid to me, like sexual incompatibility, right? Like, as much as that's like a serious problem between a man and wife, you get married in order to sacrifice to have children, and that's a pathetic fucking reason to put your child's childhood on the line because you're not getting good enough head, right? In times past, these things would have been worked through or accepted, but now they aren't because it's so easy to get a divorce and people just aren't as strong as they used to be. As well as appearing to have an absolute aversion to thinking more than perhaps 2 or 3 years into the future. Through all of the talk of divorce rape, we appear to forget how precarious a position the women are put into by a divorce. Now, of course, men get divorce raped, and that's a serious, serious problem. But women are completely isolated then. They're outside of a unit that cares for them when they get a divorce. And while they're financially stable for the moment, I don't know how much so in future, they are very socially vulnerable. In fact, as much as I may disagree with Jordan Peterson on a lot of things, he mentioned that there are a significant number of women who are essentially prey for predatory men who take advantage of them purely for sex. And a large chunk of these women are single mothers. And the thing is that I'm sure many of you men watching will know that this is a piece of piss thing to do. Even if you're not particularly charismatic or attractive, you just go find the right books and then you can do something as malicious as this. There's now actually a subclass of men that does this reliably with a significant chunk of the population, and as much as they're getting what they want in terms of poontang, these women are fucking miserable. And we cannot allow that to continue because they are, like it or not, a significant part of our society, even if you don't care particularly for their feelings. I am going to elaborate upon this in a video next week, but suffice it to say, the problem I have with a lot of the more, perhaps sex-focused self-improvement people is that they don't acknowledge the kind of problems for a society that their activities are causing, either because they don't care or they don't know. And this needs to be acknowledged when we learn about how best to fulfill ourselves as men, because there's no sense just going and grabbing pleasures at the expense of the larger society, because the society is fundamentally something that men before us built, and at the very least it is disrespectful to destroy their hard work for the sake of cummies. So what can we learn from these 3 problems that I've mentioned? I'm deliberately leaving this open so people can contribute more observations in the comments section, but here are some initial observations that I've made. We need to acknowledge that the stable family is a necessary thing, and that the majority of us should go about building something like that, and the rest cannot undermine that, because without that, we end up where we are now, and worse. This is simple natural law. If you undermine the family in such a way, if you undermine those very basic bonds that hold a society together, you're not going to be in for a good time. And if you think that now is bad, you just wait. You wait, because if we don't change this, it's going to be far worse. First of all, those of us who want to build families, we need to choose jobs where there is going to be a high enough wage for one wage to suffice for a family. For example, trades. We always need people to repair boilers and things like that, and those things are very well paying. And they're also a lot better than regular office jobs because you're at least physically exerting yourself. A large part of me, in fact, even though I do computer science, specifically cryptography in my spare time, a large part of me wants to learn welding and boiler repair just so I've got a more active job, because frankly sitting in an office all day drove me insane. However, of course, STEM degrees are very, very lucrative as well, because it does take brain power to be good at something like medicine or software engineering. And you're not going to have as much competition from women, at least within the hard sciences, because it just doesn't appeal to them. So you have less people to compete with, and therefore people will pay more for your skill. In addition, if we're not quite so lucky as to get a job like this, or we don't want that, or even if we do have those kinds of jobs, we need to be accustomed to living a lower standard of living than we could afford. Because we don't know when the money will be taken out from under us, and also we want to make way for a family, and children require money. We need to drop those habits that cost us lots of money. Alcohol, weed, video games, things that are otherwise pointless. They need to go, because a patriarch of a family cannot afford to be enslaved by those vices, even if those vices are free. They need the money and time free in order to look after their wives and their children. Also, if the daycare problem teaches us anything, we need to place the raising of our children first. Not only can we then control what goes into our children's minds in a more proper way, and not have to fulfill standards that all children are expected to make, and very little is allowed either way, but the bond that I mentioned also strengthens. So therefore we must find a way such that we can work and have ample time around our children in order to teach them and to look after them and love them. Now, one way of doing this is to work as a tradesman in the local area. You just drive around in a van and you repair boilers that are relatively close to you. But most people won't be working as tradesmen, they'll be working as white collar. And in that case, I would recommend, having done it myself, to never ever commute. Get something organised over the internet, or work in a place that's close. For example, I worked a software job for a few months, and I had a 2.5 hour round commute every day, and it effectively destroyed my social life and made me ill. Now, I would not, if I had the choice, put myself through that again, let alone any children or wife I may have. I would not do that because it's just not conducive. I'd be getting home at 7 o'clock, and it wouldn't give me much time or any energy to look after those close to me. And I can imagine that most of you probably feel the same way, especially considering I'm pretty high energy as far as things go, and I was knackered after it. Now, I have banged on this constantly, this third point, but I'm going to say it again. Be very, 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 very careful with who you pick to be your wife or girlfriend. Be very, very careful. Because if you pick the wrong one, you are screwed. This is so incredibly important that this has been written about for thousands of years. In fact, before me, I have a book that was written at least 2,500 years ago that speaks about specifically this. This is from Proverbs chapter 5. My son, attend to my wisdom, and incline thy ear to my prudence, that thou mayest keep thoughts, and thy lips may preserve instruction. Mind not the deceit of a woman, for the lips of a harlot are like a honeycomb dropping, and her throat is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, and sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down into death, and her steps go in as far as hell. They walk not by the path of life. Her steps are wandering and unaccountable. Now therefore, my son, hear me, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the doors of her house. Give not thy honour to strangers, and thy ears to the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy strength, and thy labours be in another man's house. And thou mourn at the last, when thou shalt have spent thy flesh and thy body, and say, Why have I hated instruction, and my heart consented not to reproof? And have not heard the voice of them that taught me, and have not inclined my ear to masters. I have almost been in all evil, and the midst of the church and of the congregation. If you guys want to hear more of this, This week and next week on Friday on the Renaissance Man program, which you can subscribe to in the description, I will be reading from a book called Sirach, which is probably the most eminently practical book in the entire Bible. So, if you want to learn more about how to run your life, and how to find women who are good, and how to deal with your internal disposition such that you don't get stitched up, then it may be a good idea to go into the description and subscribe to it. So, I hope that you found this useful, guys, and I'd love to hear any sort of criticism or any sort of additional statements you want to make in the comments section, because this is an exceedingly important topic that needs to be discussed a lot more in such a way that doesn't marry along partisan lines. Thank you very much for watching. A very big thank you to those on the list here. These are subscribers to the Renaissance Man program who get audiobooks and controversial videos every week for $5 a month. There's already quite a lot of content there, so if you check it out in the description, you won't be missing out. Thank you.